We have with us Anjan Sundaram. Anjan is a writer, a journalist, an academic, an artist, and a television presenter. He is a brain. In school, he won the India Physics Olympiad, did his engineering from IIT Madras, and earned a master's degree in mathematics from Yale. He has reported for the New York Times and Associated Press and is the author of 3 memoirs of journalism: Stringer, A Reporter's Journey in the Congo; Bad News, Last Journalist in a Dictatorship; and Breakup, A Marriage in Wartime. Please come up here. Use this. Anjan Sundaram has been called one of the great reporters of our age by a BBC special correspondent. In conversation with Anjan, we have Sharada Kerkar. She holds a degree in public policy with a specialization in social entrepreneurship. She was a fellow at the Gandhi Fellowship Rural Leadership Program, where she worked towards improving the learning outcomes in government schools in the tribal regions of Udaipur. She has wide experience in the fields of art and culture and is the Chief Operating Officer at MOG, the Museum of Goa. So, over to you, Sharda.
Thank you so much. Welcome, Anjan, to this conversation.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you to the Goa Festival, and thanks everyone for coming.
So before we begin this conversation, I would like to sort of draw your attention to this artwork right up on the wall and ask you a question. What do you think this artwork represents? Any thoughts? Your interpretation of it? Anyone can stand up. Please know that with art, all interpretations are valid, and that is why, that's the beauty of art. So anybody with any idea, I can come over and give the mic to you, or you can stand up and speak. Yeah.
White space.
White space. Okay, thank you.
Landscape.
A landscape. Okay, thank you so much.
What's really standing out is the question marks. Or I don't know if they're question marks, but yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
A treasure hunt map.
A treasure hunt map. Okay, that's a nice one. Thank you.
Fabricated parts of certain nations of the world.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
The map of California.
Okay. Has a similarity, yes. Anyone else? Okay, so when I got to know about the story behind this work, I was quite surprised. I was touched. I had goosebumps. So I'll invite Anjan to actually tell us a little bit about this artwork.
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for all those interpretations. It's very interesting to hear how the artwork sort of resonates for someone who has no sense of where it's come from. And that's part of the project, and that's part of the intention. So this artwork is called Disappeared Men on the Horizon, number 2. And it depicts 2 disappeared environmental activists who disappeared in Western Mexico, where I live. And they were protesting against a mining company that wanted to exploit indigenous land and a mountain that was full of gold, that is full of gold and iron. And the indigenous community that protects this land and this mountain didn't want the mining company to come in. And 2 activists, one a lawyer and one a local activist, they protested against the mining company. They held meetings to push out the mining company. And one day they were driving back after one of their meetings, and they were ambushed, they were kidnapped, and they've disappeared. and all that was left of them was this white Honda car on the highway, on the side of the highway, filled with bullet holes, and there was no blood, and these activists had disappeared. And so I and a colleague, a Mexican colleague, reporter, we heard about these two disappeared activists. We saw these posters on the walls in Mexico City. You know, they've disappeared. If you see them, please report. Those kinds of posters. In Mexico, 100,000 people have disappeared without any trace. So these are just two of the most recent ones. And so a reporter friend and I, colleague and I, we decided to travel to that area and follow their trail and try to investigate what had happened to them. And on the way, we met the son of one of the activists, and we interviewed him, and he's in hiding. The government has put him in hiding because his life is also in danger. And I opened the interview, we set up the recorder, and I opened the interview and asked him, how are you feeling? And he just broke down crying. And he said, all I want is my father to come back. I don't need to file a court case. I don't want to hold anyone accountable. I don't want anything. I just want my father to come back. And so, and he took us into his father's room with his hats, cowboy hats, and his clothes that have still been kept in that way. And disappearance is a very brutal form of revenge or violence, because many of the families have no idea where their family members are, and they don't have closure. They can't mourn them. They can't conduct a funeral, cremation, whatever it is. And so then this colleague and I, we continued our journey, and we went to the community where these two activists had disappeared. And can I keep? Yeah. Okay. So so I kind of showed up in the community. We showed up in the community, and we went to the place where this. So this community is fighting against a mining company, and it's also fighting against a cartel. You might have seen these TV series called Narcos, drug traffickers and all that. So there are narcos in that area, and they're the ones who shot at the car, disappeared these activists, and they're kind of working in alignment with the companies. So we showed up, and after a week I asked, can we go to the front line where the cartel is attacking the community? And so they took us once we had earned their trust. And we showed up in this, we arrived at this parking lot. It just looked like an empty parking lot. And then there was a wall, and we turned the wall, and it looked like this room from the Matrix, where the walls are lined with anti-aircraft guns, drones, the men in military camouflage. And I asked them, where does the cartel attack? And he said, here. This is the base where they attack. So I was like, okay, how often do they attack? And the commander said, well, every 2 days. And so I said, when is the last attack? And he said, oh, they sent 4 drones this morning carrying explosives, but they didn't drop the drones on us. But they'll be back later today, and we'll have to shoot them down or fight them back. And this war. This drone war being fought by this community against the cartel goes unreported. And that's kind of my specialty. Over the last 20 years, I've immersed myself in major wars that are important, affecting a lot of people, that don't go reported. And it's not reported in Mexico even. And so the reporting seeks to raise the profile of these wars, but then the artwork sort of, I guess we can get into the the motivations for the artwork, but the artwork seeks to complement the reporting and seeks to transform journalism. I think journalism as text, as video, as the news is no longer sufficient in this world to tell these stories, to bring these stories into the public consciousness. And so there art can play a role.
Anjan, I want to pause you there, and if you can tell us a little bit about the material that you used and why you used that material.
Yes. So that gets into why the artwork, right? So as a journalist, I go into these places, for example, this frontline, this base, I report, I write a story. But journalism has very particular and very rigid, in many ways, structure and demands. There's a demand for objectivity. You need to be factual. It needs to be verifiable. And so that it's very powerful and useful way of communicating. But as a reporter, when I come out of these places, I'm left with a lot of emotions. I'm left with the emotional weight of the people I've met, the situations I've been in. Now we've begun to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder in journalists, mental health of reporters. But for a long time, it hasn't been spoken about. It's very new in journalistic circles to speak about these things. So when I've come out for a long time, I've needed to process these emotions, and journalism didn't offer that outlet. It's a very objective outlet. So I needed a subjective medium in which to express these emotions and process these emotions. So they're not trapped inside me. They don't affect me as much, and so I can continue the work. Otherwise, it can really sort of become this weight. And so, in order to do that, I began to. What I did was I began to take photos, images of the clothes that I had worn into these conflict zones, and to make collages from them depicting scenes from the wars. So in this case, depicting these two disappeared men on the horizon who they disappeared on the horizon. You can't see them. They'd driven off into the horizon from their meeting, and then they were never seen again. And so the process of photographing my clothes and creating these scenes allowed me, on the one hand, to process my emotions. It also felt like I was taking the emotions off my body and throwing them on the canvas. And so the clothes that I've used in this artwork are the most intimate clothes. I've used my underwear, I've used my pajamas, I've used the clothes that were closest to my body. So it felt like I was taking the emotions off my body.
Thank you. Ranjit Hoskote just said that as poets, we must respond to our times, and you are doing exactly that. And I think this conversation will sort of take us through this idea of how you've used art and your writing to basically respond to the different, conflict zones that you've been reporting on. Before we move on there, just to go back and rewind in time, you were studying pure mathematics, then you went on to do a corporate job, and then eventually got into journalism. Today you call yourself a journalist artist. So how did that transition take place into journalism?
So yes, thank you to the introducer who, I guess you've researched the fact that I studied a lot of physics. I was on part of India's physics Olympiad cohort. I studied at IIT for 1 year. I did the JEE exam. So I really thought I was going to be an engineer or something in the sciences, hard sciences. And that's where I found a lot of pleasure. But from IIT, I left. I went to Yale. That's a story in itself, but I did that. And I ended up studying pure mathematics, so abstract mathematics. And I found a lot of beauty in abstract mathematics. Mathematics began as sort of a field that abstracted nature into equations. And so there was a real sense when I was starting, and I came to mathematics from physics, which is studying nature and natural processes. And so there's a real sense that you're trying to understand the world, you're relating to the real world through these abstract equations. But unfortunately, the kind of math that where mathematics has gone and where I was asked to go as a PhD, I was about to begin my PhD. I did my master's and finished my qualifying exams. And mathematics since the 19th century has embarked on a process of abstraction for abstraction's own sake, just for the beauty of it. Mathematicians would take a system like Euclidean geometry, which describes how light, for example, moves in our world, and they would just abstract and change the rules just for the pleasure of it, just to make a beautiful other world. And I spent 4 years doing this, and at the end of it, I wondered, it was incredibly beautiful. I enjoyed it a lot, but I wondered, why am I doing this? What relevance does this have to anybody's lives? The relevance of mathematics is almost accidental. We use the mathematics in some technology, in some piece of technology engineering, but that's not why mathematicians do it. And so I felt that this wasn't enough for me. And so, long story short, I began to explore other professions. I had a job at a bank. They offered me a job at Goldman Sachs as a quant, as a mathematician. building models for trading and stuff. That seemed a step closer to the real world, but also didn't seem like the right place for me. And long story short, I bought a one-way ticket to Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where at that time I had read that 4 million people had died in the war. Now it's 6 million. Had been died or directly, had been killed directly or indirectly, right? And I had no experience in journalism, but I felt that at least learning to write and traveling and becoming a journalist there, I might do something that felt relevant. And what attracted me was the fact that, one day at university when I was at Yale, I was reading at the in the lunch hall. I opened the newspaper. In the middle of the newspaper, bottom of the page, there was a little article saying 4 million people had been killed in Congo, and some little detail. And it shocked me that this was not on the front page. And so I had this sense that this war, this conflict, it should be more present in our consciousness. And I guess, so that was the beginning of the journalistic journey. And now this art is coming back to the abstraction that I really enjoyed as a mathematician. But now this abstraction, because it's speaking about disappeared environmental activists, about a community fighting a drone war to protect their ecosystem, somehow now this abstraction feels to me grounded in what's happening in the world and somehow more relevant. So then the abstraction has a different purpose and a different meaning, which I didn't find in pure mathematics.
So, after Congo, sort of what are the different places that you visited? Tell us a little bit about what you witnessed on these, the world's most unreported war zones.
So I guess to write up a list, I was in the Democratic Republic of Congo where this huge war happened. That's where I began as a journalist. I was 22 years old. That's where I learned how to write, lead an article. I was writing for the Associated Press. They hired me as a stringer. My first book is called Stringer. They paid me 10 cents a word, 15 cents a word. There was no health insurance. There was no, formal contract. It was just sort of me running around and sending them articles. And if they published, it was 10 cents per published word. So if I could send them how many words I wanted, but they would, choose how much to publish and pay me for that. But that's how a lot of journalists have started their careers. It's a very old-fashioned way. I didn't study journalism, so a lot of journalists sort of, now we have master's degrees in journalism. It's become very institutionalized, corporatized. But back in the day, maybe 30 years ago, it wasn't this way. And a lot of journalists were historians, writers, students of all kinds of fields. In my case, it was mathematics, which is maybe a little more unusual, but it wasn't unusual that somebody from a field completely outside journalism would go out into the world. From Congo, I went to Rwanda, where I wrote the Congo book, and I was teaching a class of about 12 journalists, Rwandan journalists. And they were taken out by their government one by one as I was teaching them. So one of my colleagues was shot dead on the same day. He criticized the Rwandan president. Others were imprisoned, tortured in prison. Others were threatened and had to flee the country. So I helped one of my students. I hid him in my home and I got him out of the country. And so the book describes the stories of these 12 journalists. That's my second book. It's called Bad News, Last Journalists in a Dictatorship. And the third book, which was published 2 years ago, it's called Breakup, A Marriage in Wartime. Describes my journey through the Central African Republic, which is a country just north of Congo, where during the ethnic cleansing of the Muslim population there. And I traveled through that country with a colleague from Human Rights Watch, an investigator, a human rights investigator. He was investigating massacres and trying to collect evidence to take the perpetrators to court. And I was trying to tell these stories about these very obscure massacres that weren't being reported anywhere, really. Many editors that I reached out to about financing my journey to the Central African Republic asked me which Central African Republic, not knowing that it's a country's name. So it was completely off their map, off their consciousness. Then I went to Cambodia. I reported there on the dictatorship there as well. And now I've moved to Mexico. But yeah, I guess, as a reporter in conflict zones, I guess, the story that I told you about going to the front line in Mexico is just one of many close encounters with violence. This is why I think the presence of this violence is the reason why a lot of reporters, a lot of people aren't present, a lot of witnesses, and so that becomes part of my purpose. If I can be a witness to the conflict, then what that does is two things. It makes the perpetrators of violence less powerful, and they feel less powerful because a lot of violence happens and becomes more extreme when there aren't witnesses in hiding. And this is from you can see this principle at work from the Great Wars to domestic violence, where when a couple is alone at home, then the perpetrators feel more powerful. So if there's a witness present, just by their mere presence, the level of violence can diminish. Yeah, and the second thing it does is it also provides some hope to the victims of violence. And one example is when the concentration camps were liberated in World War II. There are stories of the rabbis who went in with some of the US soldiers and liberated the camps. The first thing that many of the Jews who had been in the camps asked them was not for food or medicine. They asked them, do people know? Do people know what happened to us? And that sense or knowledge or hope that other people know, is hugely important. And so being a witness does these two things. It makes the perpetrators feel less powerful and also provides some kind of connection to victims who feel isolated and who feel there might be help that comes. And so this art does that as well. It's sort of, the idea of this art is to create new witnesses in new circles. A lot of people don't necessarily read hardcore war journalism or human rights journalism or investigative journalism. But if we can extend the chain of witnesses and make people who observe the art also witnesses to these stories, then those witnesses raise these stories in the public consciousness and perform these two functions. They make the perpetrators less powerful and they provide some kind of connection for the victims.
You also talk about the challenges of engaging people to connect with these stories. So today our social medias are bombarded with photographs of war and massacres and murders, that there is a certain looking away that happens. People want to turn away from such news. And I'm reminded of the social activist Harsh Mandir, where he speaks about in his book called Looking Away, where he says that the society slowly is moving away, becoming more indifferent, intolerant, especially towards the marginalized communities. In fact, even the state and the authorities are sort of abandoning their responsibilities towards these particular communities. So what is this challenge? Why do you think people are looking away? And how does one address this problem and bring their attention to this issue?
I think that's at the core of the questions I'm asking in these experimentations. I'm writing reportage now in verse. I've written a book-length poem that also serves as reportage. For a long time, all the three books I inserted myself, which is not common. I mean, there are certain traditions in journalism that do that, but the standard kind of approach that journalists take is to write an authoritative third-person kind of objective kind of take on a subject, say a Congo. But I've inserted myself into all these stories. So since the beginning, I've been asking myself exactly this question: why are people not looking when there's something so as massive as a war in Congo with millions of people dying? Why are they not looking? What responsibility do we have? Is there something we can do to make people look? And how can we bring these stories into the global consciousness? And so I guess yes, why aren't we looking? From my own work, I've been doing this now for 20 years. And the last piece, for example, I published a piece about these disappeared environmental activists in Granta magazine last year. And early on in the piece, you have to mention, as a journalist, sort of these two disappeared activists are just two among 100,000 disappeared activists. In the last 6 years in Mexico, 200,000 homicides have happened. People have been murdered. 30,000 a year. the level of violence is, extreme and almost insane. And myself, I wonder, reading such a piece, for the average, there might be a niche audience of people who are engaged and want to know. But for the average person, often people come up to me and say, you know what, I have a family to feed, I have a job, I have to deal with inflation, cost of things is going up. I don't have heart space. I don't have space in my consciousness, in my mind, in my heart to engage with this in any meaningful way, even more so if it's far away in Mexico. How do I even begin? What does this mean to me? So a lot of people, I think, feel that. And I think that's also, the reason why, one of the reasons why the Congo war isn't represented in the news. There's a lot of, we live in a world where the international news system, and this was a subject of my PhD in post-colonial journalism, the international news system implicitly values certain lives more than others, values certain conflicts more than others. So you'll see the war in Ukraine or Gaza, they're terrible and they deserve to be on the front page, but they make it to the front page more easily. Whereas a war in Black Africa is far more difficult. It needs some huge event, some huge massacre. Right now, Rwanda is invading Congo right now. And the last time this happened in 1996 and 1998, it sparked this war, which led to 4 or 6 million people being killed. Rwanda's doing it again. It's a big deal. But it's still not on the front page. It's shocking. So we live in a world where all these dynamics are at play. And so the question I ask myself is, how can we subvert these dynamics? And the challenge that excites me as a journalist is not necessarily getting, an article on the front page of the journalist, but getting of the New York Times, but getting an article that the New York Times might not otherwise publish on its front page. That's a challenge that excites me. Or getting a curated TED. For example, I gave a TED talk last year on their main stage about this Mexico reporting, about this environmental reporting. Now TED, they have so many concerns. They're trying to be a cultural touch point for society. So they're focused on AI right now. How can I convince a curator who's focused on AI to tell this story, have this story on their stage? That challenge really excites me. And when I'm able to do that, I feel sort of sense of achievement.
Getting back to your approach, so I think of, let's say, Pablo Picasso's painting on Guernica, where he had like a dead baby. There were women screaming, horses screaming, and he basically did this in response to the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. And there was a German man who came up to him and said, a German army who came up to him and said, what have you done? And Pablo Picasso says, I've not done anything. You have done all this and I have responded to it. So I feel like you are also using art, its aesthetic value, in a way to kind of bring more people in conversation with this subject versus, like you said, a text as a medium. So can you talk about this approach of how you're kind of bringing art and journalism together?
Absolutely. It's a response to your question, to the point you made about Harsh Mandir, who said, we're all looking away, and it's easy to look away because it's easy to look away at the conflict, at the let's say ugly parts of what humans are doing to each other and doing to the environment in the world, in the same way that it's difficult to look at the ugly parts of ourselves in our consciousnesses. So these processes for me are parallel. We want to it's easy for us to just seek to be happy, to seek positive emotions, to seek easy emotions. But Jung, for example, spoke about how there can't be consciousness without pain. He was speaking about the psychological process of self-actualization and coming to a certain kind of peace with yourself. And I think in the world, there's a similar process at play. You have to be able to look and analyze the difficult parts of what we're doing to each other in order to have some hope of peace or harmony or living together. And my response, I guess, if each of us might have a different approach to this question that Harsh Mandir has written about looking away and the need to look at these things. I came at it through hardcore, straight up journalism. for the Associated Press and, news agencies, wire agencies, where you're just, as soon as something happens, you have to be on the scene, you have to be first. That's the game. You have to be the first to report something. And so that was my training. And then I moved into memoirs, telling these stories with myself as a character, turning myself into a bridge between what's happening, say, in Congo and a reader in India or in the US. And now I'm looking at, at each point I found that there are limitations, and I'm now I'm looking at visual art or verse or collaborating with coders or artistic directors, and to see how in a society that is a visual culture that doesn't want implicitly to look at this, how can we create a facade? How can we create points of access, entry points for people, for the average person to become curious? And that's it. If they can look at this and have some kind of emotion that's evoked in them, become curious, then all the journalism, the investigations, all of that has a greater and different meaning. And that's what I'm trying to experiment in, just to see whether, what's possible, how to start these conversations about drone wars and environmental defense, which is very relevant but unreported. How to start these conversations in circles where they might not otherwise be present.
While you're really expanding the scope of journalism is largely very objective, very factual, versus bringing in arts, which is so open to interpretation, very subjective. Have you received any kind of criticism, let's say, of including arts in the journalistic space?
Yeah, a lot of journalists, not just from the art, but I think even from memoirs. There's a strong, in certain currents of journalism, there's a strong reaction against it, because it's against the training of the journalist. The journalist is taught and trained that, the situation in Congo deserves all the wordage, all the word space in the article, because it's so shocking, it's so important. It's the focus of the piece. And therefore, every word should be spent on that, on the person, on the Congolese person, on the Central African person, on the Mexican environmental defender. That's the focus. And that's how the journalistic tradition has sort of evolved over a long time, at least in the Western tradition, which I've been trained in, and that's kind of the core of my work. But when I began to investigate, for example, when I did my PhD in post-colonial journalism, my examiner was a Zimbabwean reporter who had reported for the AP also. But now he'd become a professor. And he challenged me during my examination. He said, listen, you've passed, everything's fine, so don't worry about that. We'll send you some corrections. You can make those corrections. We'll give you the PhD. But we want to have a real, he and another woman, they were my examiners. They said, we want to have a real conversation with you about journalism. And so we want you to do that without feeling fear about your degree. So the question he asked me was, do you think poetry can be journalism? And I said to him, listen, I don't think so. I'm not sure. I don't think so. I've never seen poetry. And over the course of the conversation, we both realized that public poetry in the Middle East, till today, is used as a way to bring political concerns into the public space and to hold power accountable. The example that I brought up in the examination was, I grew up in Dubai, and I have some Arab friends in Dubai. And they told me that a young Arab Emirati boy had been run over on the highway and nothing had happened. And the perpetrator, the person driving the car, was from some elite family. So a very sensitive situation. So what the mother did, she wrote this long poem praising the sheikh and saying, at the end of the poem, saying, how can something like this happen where a child is killed and no action is taken in the kingdom of a sheikh who is so great and so wise and so benevolent? And that poem spread, and it was brought to the attention of the sheikh. And that sheikh then called upon the perpetrator and held them accountable, sent them to court. And that was journalism. But it was done through verse in a very subjective way, respecting the codes and subjective requirements of dialogue, discourse in the Arab world, in the power structures in Dubai. But she held power accountable. She made a public show of what had happened, and that is a function of journalism, to hold power accountable. So if it's done, and so the Examiner and I, we came to the conclusion, okay, this poetry is journalism. It's performing the function of journalism, even though it's not necessarily entirely factual, it's not evidence based, or it's not objective. All these things that in the Western tradition are very important for journalism. In other cultures, music, poetry, visual art. So these are the questions I'm beginning to ask myself. Like, I'm not, for myself, I'm not inventing something. I'm calling upon old traditions of journalism that have existed in other cultures, but that were kind of sidelined or wiped out or marginalized as journalism developed in a very Western way. And I'm asking myself, how can we make these traditions, visual art or subjective traditions, relevant again, in the way that they have been always used?
I think like art has that power to, drive certain conversations, to, like you said, sort of awaken you and make you aware of the situations around you. You're using that power, but how is it as an artist to be political? Do you think artists should be political?
So I guess, to continue this point, I guess in the example of the poem, where the mother praised the sheikh so much before coming to the core point, I feel there's a parallel in this art. I'm presenting something aesthetic, I'm presenting something abstract, I'm presenting something non-threatening to begin with, where which can evoke some curiosity. And then I'm sort of taking them behind the curtain and say, but I'm speaking about, two disappeared activists. I'm bringing them to this political point. How can this happen in the world? Can you bear witness? What can we do about this? I'm calling them to action. And so it feels like a subversive, yes, it's a trick. It's being subversive. It's using the subversive nature of art. And again, it's not like I'm doing something new. I'm just noticing how, for example, in the Soviet Union, when in communist times, people used poetry as samizdat, as poetry. They handed it out. They wrote it down by hand and handed it out in literary or artistic circles as a way to subvert and speak to power. So there's a long tradition of using aesthetic and subjective traditions to in a political context, to either hold power accountable or to subvert power, to say things, to speak. There's also the French poet Jean de La Fontaine. He also did that. He wrote these Aesop fable type of poems that were criticizing the elite class, the aristocracy, the kings, the royalty, in a way that was not permitted in objective, straight up writing. And so it's a way for humans to express themselves. And in this case, all the factors that I presented for why the Congo War doesn't get play in the international media, or why these indigenous environmental activists in Mexico, there's a long history of racism, classism, colonialism. Mexican media has never really represented their interests, and it's shocking to me that now these communities are defending ecosystems that we all need, that our children will benefit from. But still, the racism is so strong, and the colonialism and classism, that their interests aren't represented, to our own detriment. If we lose these ecosystems, these mountains that are forested with jaguars living on them, we will suffer. And yet, we don't represent these very brave defenders. So the reason I went to Mexico was because in 2021, Mexico was the deadliest country in the world for these environmental defenders. 54 defenders were killed. Over the last 10 years, about 2,000 environmental defenders have been killed around the world, with 70% of them in Latin America, from Mexico down to Brazil. So it's kind of the hotspot, it's the front line for environmental defense. And yet we're not reporting on them. So that for me is a political question. I can't change the international media structure, but I can try to innovate and try to bring back some other traditions, use other traditions. I'm curious as an artist, as a journalist, I'm curious for other spheres where people have used other media to subvert power structures that are that are oppressing or repressing their ability to express and hold that power accountable.
As a journalist, have you ever received any kinds of threats, or can you tell us a little bit about that? Because you take a strong stand, you are courageous. So how do you deal with that?
So I guess the last, yeah, it's common. I mean, that's part of the, it's kind of occupational hazard, right? It's part of the, when I'm choosing to do this kind of work, on the other side, there are going to be threats. You are threatening powers, sometimes merely by being there. Just by being there, being a witness, they're committing some crime. They're like, who's this person? Like, so yes, it's quite common, and you have to kind of be cognizant. You have to be very careful, especially in Mexico, which is not only the deadliest country in the world for environmental defenders, it's also the deadliest country for journalists regularly, except for now because of Gaza. Gaza sort of has first place, unfortunately. But apart from Gaza, Mexico has for a long time held kind of this first ranking in how journalists are threatened. So I'm working in this situation now, which is in the crosshairs of these two forces. So yes, I'm working with a Mexican reporter who's far more at risk than I am as a foreigner. So yes, there are threats. The last threat I faced was from a Mexican government official who, in Mexico, dialogue is very oblique. They don't threaten you straight up. So I'd gone to this industrial zone that some activists had burned down, because the industrial zone was threatening an ancestral forest, which these activists wanted to preserve. So all these investors had wanted to build these factories. The activists went and burned everything down. So I showed up with my Mexican colleague. The investors saw us, they turned away. They're like, we don't want to talk to this guy. But there was a local government official who, very smiling, smiling at me, and I shook his hand. I said, my name's Anjan. He said, oh yes, I know who you are. I've read your articles. Say hello to your friend who you wrote about, who had just been convicted in court, 46 years in prison. So he began to threaten me in that very sort of suave, kind of nice way. And he basically told me, I don't think you should be here. I think you should leave. You shouldn't come back. Later that evening, I went to a communal assembly, and my colleague and we showed up. And the first thing the president of the assembly said to me, he said, oh, you're the Indian guy. That guy told me about you, the government official. He called me up to tell me about you. He told me he likes you a lot. So that's his way of threatening me. And you have to understand, in Mexico, usually you're warned. Every journalist who's been killed almost was warned before. But they chose to continue their fight, and then they were killed. And so my colleague and we had this deal that if somebody threatens us, we will leave and we will stop. And so that was a warning to us, but that was kind of an oblique warning. Besides that, I guess, being at the front line, at this frontline base, these environmental defenders, where they're fighting a drone war, that puts you in danger. In the Central African Republic, in my last book, there was a scene where I describe a scene, this moment where I managed to get access to the Christian militias that are planning this genocide, ethnic cleansing of the Muslim population in the country. And they're planning this genocide in hiding in the forest. And somehow I get access to them. I do everything that you're required to as a journalist. I make all the calls. I make a recce trip to start with. I meet them. I ask them permission. They say everything's going to be fine. Don't worry. They give me permission. They say, we'll take you in. So everything is done by the book. But on the day I drive in with my friend, we reach the headquarters of the Christian militia, and we didn't know, but the government had planned to attack them on that day. So we arrive at the same time. So I get out of the car, and there are 300 guys with guns pointing at me. The commander says, you're a spy, you're a scout for the government, and stay on this road. If they come here to kill us, they'll kill you first. And he's like, you're not going anywhere. And he says, you're betraying us. You're basically, observing our military installations. You're sending the information back to them so they can kill us. And so that described in the book how I negotiated with him over 3 hours. I asked him permission to sit under a mango tree in the shade. He allows me. So that's a little victory. He has some humanity. He shows some humanity for me and my colleagues. And then at one point, I hear one of his fighters behind me say, in French, he says, let's just kill them. And we're in the middle of nowhere. The French army doesn't even patrol there. If we're killed, we'll be thrown in a ditch and nobody will find us probably for weeks or months. And I hear this guy saying, let's just kill them. And I feel in my spine, okay, it's going to happen now. I'm going to die in this moment. So I remember I looked up at the mango tree. I looked up at the sky. I looked up around me. I was like, wow, this is such a beautiful place in which to die. And so there was this moment, I think it's necessary to accept death and to accept that somebody's going to kill you. And then I thought, I don't want to die. I'm gonna do something about this. So I stood up and I said to the commander, I said, if anything happens to me or anybody with me, it's going to be really bad for you. And there was a total bluff because I had no real power. But I bluffed. And he looked me in the eye, I looked him in the eye, and he believed me. And so he told all his fighters, guns down, guns down. And they were Christian militia. And so then he said, okay, you guys can go, but your driver, they found out that our driver was Muslim. And they said, your driver has to stay. And then my colleagues stood up and said, no, we are either all leaving or nobody's leaving. And then the commander, there was a little negotiation. He said, okay, fine, you guys can all go, but we'll take everything in your car. So we said, sure. So they took our mattresses, mosquito nets, medicines. It was kind of sad to see because these militias, even though they're planning a genocide and they committed an ethnic cleansing, very violent, very brutal, they didn't have medicines. They didn't have, they were themselves like poor villagers who had been co-opted or somehow tricked into this political, battle. And so they took everything from our car. They took our phones, they took our everything. And we just got into this empty car and we drove as fast as we could out. And about a half an hour outside the rebel territory, there were 4 government car pickups that went full speed in the other way with soldiers fully armed in the back seats with the rocket launchers, heavy weapons. And they were, sort of barreling into the rebel territory to attack them. So their information had been correct and they had been reasonable in a way to suspect us. So sometimes you just get unlucky. Stuff like this happens and you need to, you get unlucky and you need to be a little lucky to get out. So that's like one example.
Why choose such a dangerous, risky profession?
I guess,
What drives you?
I guess, to what I said in the beginning, I said, I feel there aren't many people who are doing this. And so when I ask myself, why is my work relevant? When I'm doing stuff like this, when I'm in that place, when I'm reporting on the Christian militia, and they said to me genocidal things, so I recorded that and I got out. That's something that the world needs to know. And I feel that there's no question in my mind about whether this work is relevant. I know it is. In many other things with mathematics, with abstract mathematics, I had to ask myself, why am I doing this? What relevance does it have? And then I had to convince myself, oh, this abstract mathematics is being used in technology for computers, it's helping people's lives. But it seemed very removed, kind of second, third degree. Here, there's no question. You know that you're doing something that's relevant because of the absence of people. So that's just a very simple answer. I think there are many other reasons, but just putting myself and becoming a witness where there aren't any means that there's some impact, some contribution that you're making. So I guess.
There are several, I think, journalists who also look up to you and the kind of work that you do. What is that one advice to also, let's say, emerging and upcoming journalists who perhaps want to take the approach of journalism that you've taken? Not perhaps the subject, but the approach to writing, to creating, to, sort of write. Your narratives are very personal, they're very subjective, they're not authoritarian. So what advice would you give them?
I don't know if I have advice. I guess, I hope that the work speaks to people and maybe inspires people to also do something similar, but also to innovate and find their own voice. I found a voice in the writing that's helped me, but now I'm trying to expand. I'll keep writing. I will always write. I think it's my medium of expression. It's what sort of calls to me. But I'm experimenting with other media, and I would, I guess encourage, I would hope, I wouldn't encourage, I would hope that through the work I can speak to other people. yeah, I don't know if I would directly give advice. I think, especially in journalism, it's a field in crisis, especially independent journalism, freelance journalism, like what I do. There's very little pay. There's huge threats from corporations that have armies of lawyers that want to protect their corporate interests. Threats from governments that have the entire security services at their disposal, army, police, these government officials who threaten me. Um, Threats from organized crime. India might be gundas or whatever, but in Mexico it's cartels that are hugely powerful and have economic, social interests in these places where I'm reporting on. So it really is a choice of career that you have to make for yourself. You have to feel this is worth it and you want to do it. So I can't really advise anyone to do it. But I'm hoping by going in and doing this work myself, and by finding different ways to express the stories there, express my own feelings, because that's another purpose of this art, is to express my own feelings and be able to process those emotions. I'm hoping that by doing that, people can find a reason, their own reason, to come at this work and do that, and that I can learn from them. I have to say that the Mexican colleague with whom I traveled, he's 28 years old, 29 now. He's still at university studying journalism. I have to say, I've learned as much from him as he's learned from me. Or we've had these conversations there's a mutual exchange. He's maybe learned where journalism has been for the last 20 years. But I learned from him not only the context in Mexico, but also new approaches to journalism. We would go into some village where, we were at a cemetery with this father who was showing us his kid's grave. And while we were there, the father received a text from a cartel. And, the cartel is called the Familia Michoacana, the Michoacan family. Michoacan is a state in Mexico. And this text said, "You're messing with the wrong family." And he showed us his text. He said, and he wrote back, he was like, "Which family?" He just played dumb. But these people they're on the front lines. They're ordinary people, they're incredibly brave. And if I can communicate some of their stories and my story through the work, then maybe people might be inspired and find their own way. And I would like to learn from how they would innovate as well. So it's a conversation for me.
I think before we open the floor to a few questions, I just wanted to say that, my father, an artist, Sharada Kerkar, he often says that when we live in such challenging times and you're almost breathing political air, and when you're breathing such political air, you have to exhale political art. And I think when I see you and when I see your work, I think you're a great example of that. And I think all of us have so much to learn from you. You're so inspiring, Anjan, and thank you so much for being here today and sharing everything that you did.
No, thank you. And I feel like bringing traditions together that are seemingly unrelated, there's a lot to learn from both.
Yeah.
So thank
Yeah.
you as well.
Yeah.
I visited the Museum of Goa a couple of days ago, and it was really inspiring to see some of how these political conversations happen.
One question. Yeah. So
Sorry, I've grabbed that. So thanks, that was fascinating. So many of us are journalists because we believe that bearing witness diminishes the perpetrator of injustice to themselves and to the people around them. When the Bombay riots happened in 1992, we always believed that 900 people died in that violence because there were no TV cameras around. And yet it's almost as if our delusion was shattered because the Gujarat riots happened a decade later, and that was India's first televised riot. And the people who perpetrated it are now in power. There's also this other sort of paradox in that.
The question.
Yes, I'm coming to that, sir. That sort of from American lynchings photographs in the American South to now people in India who conduct lynchings take videos of themselves. It's empowering. How do you see this seeming paradox between how we see ourselves and what we can achieve, and yet there's sort of evidence that maybe we're a little delusional?
Yes, so great question, and I think I'll answer with the answer I gave to the Rwandan journalists who I was teaching in Rwanda. And I was 26, and these journalists was often older than me. And they asked me, we're reporting in a dictatorship. What hope do we have, of success, of breaking this dictatorship? And I didn't have an answer for them. Like, I didn't have a clear answer. Incredibly brave and committed people. And it happened that was 2009, and it was the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And Václav Havel wrote an opinion piece. Václav Havel was a president of the Czech Republic. He had been an activist. And he wrote in that piece, when I was an activist fighting against dictatorship, people thought I was crazy. People thought that this dictatorship is so powerful, it's this monolith that can't be broken. And I thought I was crazy. But I still did this work. I still circulated these Samizdat journals, still wrote my literature, did my art. We had these meetings at great risk, underground meetings. And he said, it shocked me, one day, the dictatorship just fell. The whole thing, as monolithic and as unbreakable, as powerful as it seemed, as quickly it crumbled. Even I was surprised. And I saw at that point that all my work had some effect, had some meaning. And so I share your there's almost a sense of hopelessness. You can't see the light at the tunnel. But many people who've come before us, I take inspiration from them, and I find hope in them, because they also didn't see the light. But they continued their work, and at some point, the tyranny does break down. And you see that everything that you did in secret, seemingly sort of helpless, hopeless, powerless, it all had an effect. And I guess there's something beautiful and intangible in that, in how our words and our expressions have an effect.
I feel terrible about bringing this session to an end. I know it could have gone on for at least another 15 minutes, but we have the next session to start immediately after this. On behalf of Goa Writers, thank you so much, Anjan. Thank you, Sharada, for this lovely session. Thank you, and thank you all of you.